What's shaking bacon? Today we are going to be editing this photo together in Lightroom. I'm going to share with you a dirty little secret of something I've been doing recently. I hope you won't judge me too harshly for. I'll also be sharing with you some of my favorite edits in Lightroom, some things that you won't find in the basic panel. So if you want to venture past the basic panel, it's going to be a great video for you. But if you've never been here before, I'm Joni Simon. This is my food photography studio. I am a commercial food photographer, and I'm so excited to have you here. I hope you take away some really helpful nuggets so you can take your food photography to the next level. But let's go ahead and jump into this photo. So just a little backstory on this image. I captured this weekend, and I was testing out some recipes for a cookbook that I'm going to be shooting in October. So my friend Christina Beretta, incredible food writer, she is working on a cookbook right now featuring local chefs from the Phoenix area, and I have been hired to be the food photographer for the cookbook, which I am beyond honored to get to do. It's going to take most of the month of October, but currently we're in the process of testing all of the recipes because the chefs have submitted these recipes, but we want to make sure that people can actually execute them. So I was testing this yellow gazpacho with Dungeness crab on top. It is absolutely delicious, and it was beautiful. So I thought, let's go ahead and photograph it. And two, last week I'd had a conversation with the creative team, with the art director for the cookbook, and gotten some input as far as like colors and surfaces and palette and things like that. Like, we're still working through the mood board and whatnot. But I was like, let's go ahead and do a little test shoot and see if it's kind of along the lines of what they're looking for. So here's the photo straight out of the camera, no edits made so far. But what you might notice, my dirty little secret of what I do from time to time in certain situations, is that you might notice that that file format is a JPEG. It's not a RAW file. And you go, but Joni, you have to shoot RAW all the time. Well, you don't have to, right? There is a reason that JPEG is an available format in your camera. And certainly I am a huge proponent of shooting in RAW. If you're not familiar with shooting in RAW, you definitely need to educate yourself on that. I've got a video about it below. There are hundreds of videos here on YouTube all about shooting in RAW. So go check those out and learn about it, because definitely when I shoot the cookbook, it will be shot in RAW format, no questions asked. But in this situation, when I'm doing a test shoot, when I'm just having fun, when these are only intended really for social media use, it's going to go up on Instagram, I'm in a controlled environment where I'm not going to have like issues with overexposure or underexposure. I really know my lights well. I've got the white balance dialed in. I know I'm not going to do a ton of manipulation to this photo. And so in that case, JPEG is totally groovy, because one of the nice things about JPEG is that the camera is processing that image for you. It's making some decisions. It's adding a little bit of sharpening. It's manipulating the colors a little bit. And so that JPEG might be a little closer to your intended final image in the first place. And so I'm just going to add some additional little tweaks to take it to the next level. So all that to say, true confessions right here on the bite shot, I don't always shoot RAW. Don't judge me. Certainly when I'm shooting for clients, RAW, no questions asked, 100% all the time. But when I'm shooting for myself, when they're fun images, when I want to zip through things quickly, I might shoot JPEG. So now with that out of the way, let's move on to more important things. Let's edit this photo together. So very first thing I'm noticing is our histogram, and that this image is just slightly underexposed, which is something I do. I just like to have a little bit of wiggle room there on the top end in order to adjust the photo. It's totally up to you. Now, if you're not familiar with how to read a histogram, definitely something you should learn about. And my absolute favorite resource for understanding the histogram is a really cheap $3 digital book from Amazon. I've got it linked below. So definitely go check that out. If you understand the histogram, it's going to make so much more sense in terms of exposure and the exposure you're getting for your images. So in this case, I want to brighten this photo up just a little bit, which we can also generally see in looking at that photo, but sometimes our screens lie to us. So it's just nice to have that histogram as a guide. And our first thing that most people do is jump into the basic panel, right? Like increase the exposure or increase the whites or open up the shadows. But what I actually like to do is I like to primarily work in the tone curve. And so you might look at these and go, aren't those the same things? Like, you know, highlights in the tone curve versus highlights in the basics panel. Like, are they really that different? And actually they are, which might seem crazy. There's a lot of technical that goes into how the basic panel is different than the tone curve. But in general, you can think of it this way, is that the basic panel has intelligence built into it to understand certain things about the image in terms of where are the edges and the lines in the photo and the subject, and manipulate manipulating the different parts of the images differently. Whereas the tone curve are more direct controls that it doesn't care if there are lines in image or more contrast in certain parts of the photos. It doesn't have that built-in intelligence. It's just saying these are bright pixels and these are dark pixels, and this is how we're going to manipulate these. And that might sound really abstract because it is. And so I've got some articles linked down below if you want to read more about it. But like anything, I just highly recommend getting in there and playing around with things. And I'll show you what I mean. A great example of this is the shadows slider. So here up in the basic panel, you've probably played around with the shadows before, right? You take the shadows to the right, it kind of opens up those shadows, and it's lightening up kind of generally things overall in the image. It's also kind of brightening it up a little bit. So you can open up those shadows or you can bring those down. And that's having an impact on the overall image, kind of a global edit. Whereas if I go down into the tone curve and we play with the shadows slider, if we bring that up, it is only making changes to the shadowy and darker tones in the image. Remember, we manipulated shadows up in the basic and it affected the whole image. Whereas here in the tone curve, it is only isolating to those pixels that are present in the image, regardless of lines in the image, regardless of the subject. It is only changing those dark pixels and either making those brighter or darker, which when it comes to shadows, if I want to intensify the shadows, but I don't want to darken anything else in the image, this is my secret weapon. That's my little ninja move right there to really make things pop, to accentuate shadows while not making any other changes to the brighter tones in the image. Pretty cool, right? So when it comes to these differences in terms of the basic panel versus the tone curve, a strategy that a lot of people use that I highly recommend is to do kind of your basic edits in the basic panel and then come in and do those smaller nuanced changes and really like those refined edits in the tone curve. But now for me personally, I just really feel most comfortable in the tone curve. So that's actually where I do the majority of my editing in terms of exposure. So like I mentioned, this image here on the histogram is just slightly underexposed. So if I want to boost the exposure only using the tone curve, what I can do right here is take these brights and start to bring them up to the right. And we can also see then too, see how that histogram starts to shift? And I'm just going to dial this up until we get a little closer to that right side, about 30. Of course, I don't want to lose all that lovely detail that's here in that gorgeous crab because that was not cheap crab, I'm going to tell you right now. But now in boosting that brightness, we've added a little bit of contrast. And what I was personally going for in this was something a little bit lighter. I want to alleviate some of that heavy sort of feeling that's been created by creating that larger contrast of the brighter tones versus the darker tones. So I'm going to take those darks just up just a little skosh, just to kind of add some lightness, kind of add some airiness to the vibe. So taking that up 10. But I don't want to lose that definition. Like I said, that little ninja move, that little bit of oomph and kick that you get by bringing down the shadows in the tone curve. So I'm going to throw those down. You see if I throw them real far, it really gets pretty dark. I don't want it to be that intense. But now you can see just those minor little changes right here in the tone curve has now adjusted my exposure for the amount of brightness that I'm looking for. It's added some definition and contrast, but it's still pretty subtle that if we did a little before and we a little after, you can see just how much those three little sliders impacted this photo. And so now my next stop in this photo, and this was partially due to the conversation with the art director at the cookbook, was that we're going for something a little more desaturated, that we don't want those super vibrant, super colorful, like we certainly want color, right? It's a food cookbook and food is all about color. We eat with our eyes, but we want it to be a little bit more desaturated. And two, with this yellow, I mean, that is like a poppy yellow. So it almost doesn't look natural. So what I want to do is dial down this yellow just a bit. I'm going to take it down, you know, around the -15. You're like, oh, that starts to look really bland. Now, one of the things, again, and we've talked about this in terms of color, is that our eyes start to deceive us with colors after you've been looking at something for a while and you're like, oh, wow, that looks so sad. But maybe you dial down the saturation, look away for a little bit, and you come back and you're like, oh, no, that looks totally normal. So just always keep that in the back of your mind in terms of saturation, is that your eyes could be lying to you. So take breaks as necessary. But anytime I take down the saturation, something that I can do is then add a little bit of vibrance. And there is a wonderful video. It is my absolute favorite. I feel like I couldn't explain it better in terms of the difference of saturation and vibrance. So I'll link that video down below for you to go check out. But in this case, I just want to bring a little bit of life back to it without overdoing it. And vibrance is going to allow me to do that. So just bringing it up ever so slightly. overlay. So we've got kind of that more muted, more subtle color palette, while still looking delicious, while still looking realistic. And again, a little before and a little after. So now we're pretty much in the home stretch of editing this photo. Like I said, there's not a ton of manipulation going on with this one, just little tweaks that add that little extra kick to it. And so what we're gonna do at this point now is add some filters. If you're not familiar with the radial filter tool or the brush tool, I've got a video step-by-step understanding how these tools work and how to apply them. You can find that link down below. But if you're already familiar or want to see how I'm going to do it here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up the brush tool, because what I'm noticing is that, you know, we've got, of course, that gazpacho, the yellow, like it jumps right off the page. We have no problem seeing that and really getting that separation and differentiation. But when it comes to that crab, it's white, it's a little soft. And so I just want to add some definition, add some kind of texture and sharpness to it so that it pops just a little bit more. So I've picked up the brush tool and I've got show select mask overlay just so I can see where I'm painting with this. And we also want to make sure that the size of that brush is appropriate for what we're painting over. And so I'm going to paint right over the crab. Of course, whatever comes up pink is where we are applying this brush tool. All right, that's pretty good. And so now anywhere in this lighter gray section, any changes I make there will only affect where I've painted. And so my very first stop, my new favorite thing that was released in a recent update to Lightroom from Adobe, is the texture slider. If you've not played with this, you need to get in and play around with it. When it comes to portraits, what we can do with faces is we can bring the texture down, which will smooth out the beautiful, you know, skin that we have and reduce any sort of fine lines or pores or things like that, while still maintaining the rough edges, like the general lines in the face. But when it comes to food, instead of taking the texture down, we want to increase the texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm really going to bump up that texture. You can see if I take it from here up to here, we take it into that 60 range. It's created that little bit of extra definition. Again, if we kind of come here, it feels a little soft. It's like a little harder to see those individual pieces of crab. Whereas if we really boost that up, I mean, don't go crazy because it starts looking a little wild at a certain point, but add that texture. And then I'm also going to boost the clarity. What clarity does is that's just going to help add just a little bit of contrast and also define those major edges of each of the pieces of the crab by just adding a little bit of contrast of the brighter tones and the darker tones. So again, just helping us to see that a little better. You don't want to go too crazy because then it starts to look a little wild. Just like with any editing in this, my personal philosophy is keep it subtle, keep it natural. But I like now how the crab looks. If we do a little before, a little after, we've got the definition of the crab. The overall filling is brighter. But now one of the things that when I go back to the before, I did like more of that darker tone and the more, you know, deeper pink that was going on with the background. And when we boosted all of that exposure in terms of that tone curve, we added those lights, it also lightened up the background. So what I want to do is I want to darken the background again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a radial filter right here, drag it out onto the scene. And again, show select mask overlay just so I can see where I'm putting it. And I'm gonna put it around our soup. Now, right now, it's that pink is hitting the edge of the bowl because I have a pretty soft feather on it. So I'm gonna open up and just lessen that feather a little bit. Make sure that we line it up right here with the bowl. Looking good. Cinch it in on the sides. So now what I can do is just bring the exposure around the bowl. Obviously it's leaving the bowl as it was, but now with that background being a little bit darker, it really makes that crab pop so much more. If you haven't watched my composition series, definitely go check it out. It's the idea of creating salience, that the brightest part of the image in contrast to everything else is gonna jump out at us more. So by darkening that background, not only do we get that beautiful pink tone, which so nicely complements the yellows and those greens that are in the image, but again, it just creates that sort of contrast with the crab so that the crab just really comes out at us. And so now we do a little before and a little after, and it's almost like it kind of flip-flopped, right? Like the original image, the background was a little lighter, the food was darker, and now the food is brighter, the background's darker. Again, just opportunities to manipulate our image to make that subject the most important thing in the image. But now the most important thing when it comes to this image is then after I processed it and then I shared it over in Instagram stories, the art director for the cookbook said, I love it. So as long as the art director is happy, mama's happy, all is right with the world. So thank you so much for stopping by. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you can join me again for my next tutorial. I hope you stay out of trouble and I'll see you soon. Okay? Bye.